Let's take a seat for the next panel, please. Right, we will just begin if we could. Christine? Right. Okay. So my name is John Kampfner. I am not Oliver Moody. Oliver is unwell, cannot take part. I'm a journalist, author based in Berlin. Are we doing this? Machen wir auf Englisch oder Deutsch? English. Okay, we're doing it in English. Okay. We only have 45 minutes for this panel because the last panel overran by 20 minutes. So we are going to have to. No, but I have to go. That was the whole idea. I had to go at 1:45. Okay, so we are talking about the state of freedom in the US and Europe. We have an illustrious panel above us. So let's just get straight into the discussion. I'm going to ask you, Constanze, to start on this. The state of freedom in the US and Europe. I suppose what I would like, by way of introduction, all of us to do is to disentangle what freedom means in the new world order, because freedom, sure as anything, does not mean necessarily liberal democracy, nor does it necessarily mean liberalism. In any case, over to you to give some, we'll go around the panel giving some introductory thoughts, and then we'll develop the conversation, and if we have time, we'll have one or two questions.
All right. Hi. Is this working? Yeah. Yes. All right. Well, first of all, thank you very much to the LibMod organizers for inviting me on this panel. This strikes me as an extraordinarily urgent topic, and I'm very pleased and humbled to be sitting in this company. As for the state of freedom in the United States, where I have been living for the past 10 years, I want to say... Sorry?
I think that's just telling people to be quiet at the back.
Okay, that would be lovely. I want to say that I find myself still in a sort of probing, determinative mode and mood. I don't think I'm in a position to sit here and confidently rattle off a series of assessments of the state of freedom in the United States, for the simple reason that I think the next administration is full of internal inconsistencies, incoherences, and there are things I think they do not yet know about themselves, right? So I have developed an internal checklist, right, of things that I will be watching for, but I cannot say to you with clarity, this is where I think we are. And despite the fact that, of course, we all know that there are sort of the people in the Trumpian orbit who have very disturbing ideas. But let me make 2 points here. One is that while there has been a great deal of focus on the so-called trifecta of the Trumpian electoral win, which in reality is a quadrifecta because, or quinquefecta if you want, he has the popular vote, he has the Senate, he has Congress, the White House, and also, to a large degree, the courts. And in the Supreme Court, there are 3 justices who will be up for retirement, and so 3 positions to be filled within the next 4 years. So there is has been a sense in the commentary of this election that what we will now be seeing is something like unitary government. The German expression is durchregieren. I want to argue against that. For one, we've already seen a sort of massive disagreement between 2 important camps. The camps of the libertarians. They are authoritarian libertarians, to be sure, but they have a very specific set of ideas that is quite at odds with the other large camp, the National Conservatives. One is for open borders, the other is for closed borders. One is, I think, religiously indifferent. The other one is very much a religious movement, but a fusionist movement, right? One wants no states whatsoever. The National Conservatives are actually the first right-wing movement in America to want a large state, and one that decrees what we in German constitutional theory call the Gemeinwohl, the public good. Now, there are distinct overlaps, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but that is a very, very important cleavage, which I think will generate a great deal of turmoil and chaos. The second point I want to make, that as somebody who once, before I went into journalism and then went downhill from there, trained as a constitutional lawyer, I suppose the thing I care most about is when people start fiddling with the machinery of the liberal order. In other words, when they start changing the rules. It is one thing to exhaust institutions. It is one thing to exhaust markets or civil society through chaos, right, or conflict. It is quite another to start changing the rules and changing the institution. Now, for some people absolutely want to do this, and the model is Orban's Hungary. So I will be watching for that. And to me, that, I think, is really the point where sort of qualitative change in democracy takes place. But we aren't there yet. But if it happens, I think I will be commenting on it. Thank you.
Thank you for those introductory remarks. I'm interested to know further about the checklist. You've mentioned issues around large state, small state, open borders, closed borders. It'd be quite interesting to develop what the checklist is. You use the term liberal order, which is often used to refer to post-1945 order. I'm intrigued.
Can I just maybe be more precise? I mean representative democracy, right? With checks and balances on power, protection of minorities, prevention of cruelty, if you want to use a term created by Judith Clark, and the protection of political pluralism. Yeah.
I mean, leaving aside that liberalism means different things in different societies, and you know, I'm always fascinated by that term. To me, it feels more like a value than it does a structure. But anyway, we'll develop those thoughts in a further second. Christina, over to you for some introductory thoughts.
Thank you. And thank you, of course, for inviting me to Berlin. I come from a political culture where the word liberal is, how could I put it politely, ambiguous. And of course, the worst is neoliberal. When you are labeled in Paris, in France, as a neoliberal, you're in for trouble. So, being no philosopher and no gardener, and only a journalist, I'm relieved that at least in the title of this panel, there's the word Europe. Because I feel that the challenge is to us Europeans, that indeed the revival of liberal democracy, or indeed fighting for liberal democracy, it's a common challenge. And it shouldn't be analyzed, in my view, in national or even patriotic terms, as indeed my colleague mentioned in the previous panel. And I think, you know, there are endless conferences, not as interesting as this one, of course, but endless conferences, endless literature about the doom and gloom about liberal democracy. And I think we really have to change the narrative. We have to be proud. We have to be proud of what has been achieved in Europe in particular. And of course, Tocqueville wrote splendidly about America, but after all, he was French. The French tend to forget about Tocqueville, unfortunately, so I will encourage them to read your book, of course. So I think we have to change the narrative. We have to be more provocative, more voluntary, and indeed consider that populism is, of course, the wrong answer to all sorts of fairly legitimate questions. Not all of them legitimate, but some of them are legitimate. And I think we have to look for common answers to those questions, rather than try and reason within the boundaries of our respective political cultures. The difficulty, of course, is that we are now facing, as Constanze put it very well, a kind of American, how could I put it, reactionary acceleration. You have indeed, I mean, Joe Biden had the right words. Pity he didn't always act accordingly. But it's true, we are going to face an oligarchy of tech billionaires using the sort of MAGA crowds that J.D. Vance very well described in his book, Hillbilly Elegy. And J.D. Vance, in my view, is even more dangerous than some of these guys that are overly mentioned in our media, because J.D. Vance already put the equation, if you Europeans do not actually dismantle the regulations that, in our view, are protective of our liberal democratic values, and that's basically what we do as Europeans. Unfortunately, we only regulate, but still. And Vance said, oh, if you don't dismantle those, you will not have NATO security protection anymore. So, again, I don't want to be too long, of course, but I would really vouch for a more proactive, ambitious, less gloomy, not optimistic, but less gloomy, and more energetic reaction to populism. And of course, in France, we have Marine Le Pen, and we have presidential elections in 2 years' time. 2 years, time for action.
Thank you very much indeed for that. We'll come back to that last point in a second. Volodymyr, it's a delight to have you here. And when one thinks of freedom or the lack of it or the infringement of it, thoughts immediately turn to Ukraine, where it is surely much more clearly defined in geostrategic sense in terms of sovereignty sense. I was wondering if you could just, in the brief opening remarks, outline what you think freedom could look like post-conflict, or whatever else you want to say. Because for me, what is absolutely fascinating is, I'm not talking about the borders and the state of the borders, but the type of society that will emerge from the trauma of the last 3 years and more.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here. As usual, it takes me 24 hours to get from Kyiv to Berlin. It takes me 1 hour to get from Warsaw to Berlin, so a little bit of difference. Look, in Ukraine, we have a word for freedom which is called wola. I think in the Polish language we do have, right, Karolina? Yeah, maybe in some Slavic languages as well. Vola in Ukrainian means both freedom and the will, the strength of the will to fight for this freedom. And I think this is, vola means freedom despite unfreedom. And the word unfreedom is very pronounced in Ukrainian language, which is called nevola. And basically, we have a word nevilnik, which means a slave. And I think the whole history of our fight, not for just 3 years, but I would say for hundreds and hundreds of years, is how to ensure freedom in a geography that is so much open to the challenges of unfreedom. And well, we do perceive our history, I mean myself and many other of my compatriots, as as a history where the attempt to have freedom in a very European sense of the term, in the sense of ensuring rights, in sense of ensuring pluralism, as a quite successful since the medieval times up until the early 18th century, when finally the Russian Empire took over. And I do think that this is a paradox that with the same, Christine was mentioned Tocqueville, but we can mention some previous French thinkers who were starting to think about Eastern Europe as a kind of a barbarian land where there is no freedom. And there is a wonderful book of Larry Wolff, the New York professor, about this. It's coinciding with basically takeover of the Russian Empire. Because, I mean, Sartre said famously that nous sommes condamnés d'être libres, which means we are condemned of being free. And in this phrase, the most interesting word for me is condamné. Why he would use this term, which is a very religious term, we are condemned, as if we have this péché originel, the original sin of being free, which means that probably he meant that many people around the world are feeling that they are blessed to be unfree, because being unfree is very easy. Being unfree is much easier than being free. And I do think that what we lack, and I listened to a very interesting panel previously, and I have lots of questions about this, but it's really thought-provoking. But what we lack is an understanding that liberalism is not about warm bath. Liberalism is not about something, okay, we are born free, as Rousseau said. I mean, this is a big illusion that we are born free. We are born unfree. We are born unable to speak. We are born unable to talk. We are born unable to walk, etc., etc. And I think that Ukrainian experience really gives us this close connection between freedom and fight for freedom. And therefore, this word, voля, is very important. Now, to your question, post-conflict. We really avoid these questions now in Ukraine. I mean, this is not something we can imagine, unfortunately. We can have a ceasefire this year, or probably not have a ceasefire. Will ceasefire really means the end of the war? Most probably the answer is no, if we don't have the security guarantees. Looking at Trump administration, we understand that they are not willing to go that far as thinking of security guarantees. And therefore, there is nothing that gives me an idea that, okay, we will have the end of the war this year. Therefore, the real question for the Ukrainian society is how to proceed with the values of freedom despite lots of things that makes us unfree. Right now, there is air raid siren in Kyiv. I'm worried about my kids. It's every day. If something goes onto your house, if you lose a house, if you lose your family members, if you lose your life, that all makes you unfree. Contemporary Ukrainian society is a society very difficult because, well, do we have the same rights for everybody? Of course, no. Because soldiers have much less rights than civilians. They cannot leave, they cannot go somewhere, etc. So we have a very, very dramatic discussion about what does it mean to be a democracy at war? What does it mean to be a democracy which is endangered? But I frankly do think that we should look at Ukraine, and you guys, I advise you to look at Ukraine as something that the experience that can you teach you something, and the teaching is that liberty and freedom is not a warm bath. So we are entering the period, we have already entered it, where freedom is not given to you, where you need to fight for it. And therefore, this idea of fight and effort is a very important thing. We also need to probably think about the idea that there are other cultures in the world, or what Huntington called civilizations, which are probably not based upon the idea of freedom, which are probably based upon other ideas like human being is not a separate entity, individual is not a separate entity, he or she doesn't have individual rights, but rather it's kind of a cells in a big organism. It's probably the way how China thinks the world. It's definitely how Russian ideology tries to see the world. And it's definitely not how Ukrainians see the world, not how Europeans see the world, not how Americans see the world, not how probably many other societies see the world. But we are entering this period where this, I don't really like the term populism. I think it doesn't explain us anything. I really agree that there are many, many elements of this. But there is this trend of libertarianism, but I do think that there is this neo-authoritarian trend. And we need to understand that, that the 21st century will probably be the century of very, very intense fights for values. Whose value system will win? And by the way, responding to what Alan was saying, I really agree that liberalism needs to think in terms of morality and need to bring values, or like ancient philosophers were saying, virtues back. But we also need to understand that if we bring values back, we also bring the conflicts around values back, because we don't have the infinite tolerance space. We will have a kind of a period of new religious wars maybe, or religious conflicts, or ideological conflicts. And I think we need to be sober about this and look not in the terms like what will happen when the conflict is over. Unfortunately, I rather see the 21st century as a century where conflicts will multiply and multiply, because we have so many differences in value systems, and they are so much radicalizing themselves, and all these value systems have capacity to act.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for that, Volodymyr. Again, I want to come back to you on that. But Jarosław, just a few words from you, because in Poland, you have the two poles, sorry, the poles meant in the other sense of the term, of executive power, the presidency and the prime ministership in direct conflict. You are sort of the epicenter, very easy to discern the two value systems at loggerheads with each other. How is that sense of freedom being how can it be being interpreted so very, very differently right at the heart of executive power?
Well, it helps you to understand the world we're living. In fact, it helps us to understand that today, and perhaps that will be an answer to what Constanze said, that we were trying to understand, at least temporarily, to recreate some schemes of understanding the world we're living in. And I believe that there are some moments that we have, there's a glimpse that we got it. And from Poland, perhaps it's easier after 8 years of populism, because what we are experiencing in democracies in the West is that we have three trends. It's like three currents. And by the way, today Jan Zielonka mentioned Italian churches. So I would add to that Notre Dame ceremony, because it was exactly the Gothic architecture is said that perhaps it's the best organization of what is visible for human beings. And it helps you to see something very sharply. And therefore we had this ceremony, and Trump came, Donald Trump, and then we had President Steinmeier, and we had President Macron, and it was possible to understand that today we have a kind of triangle of, let's call it a triangle from Notre Dame, for the sake of our conversation, that we have the countries in which there are populists in power, the countries in which there are populists were not in power, like France, Germany, and there are also countries that had populists in power. And I believe it changes a lot our perception of one of the key words of today's conversation: what is populism? Because populism before getting power means in practice something very, very different. And fast forward, I would like to go more down to earth area. Why is it so important in January 2025? Obviously, the reason why we should take it into consideration, this triangle from Notre Dame, is that, in fact, Donald Trump is taking power, and for small and medium-sized countries, and here I think on equal terms of Poland, Ukraine, Taiwan, South Korea, and many others, there was a scheme of acting for the last 30 years to a kind of a regime mimicry for the sake of preserving sovereignty. The word, by the way, you've mentioned. To preserve sovereignty, we were adapting to some democratic standards. And there is a fascinating question that, by the way, is going to be very tangible this year. Could Donald Tusk confront Donald Trump for the sake of liberal democracy? In fact, it's almost unthinkable, but that's the reality, that in fact we have a liberal democrat in Poland that at some point in time will confront Donald Trump. Is he allowed, politically speaking, is he allowed to preach the values of American democracy to Donald Trump or Elon Musk, by the way, who was also present at the Notre Dame ceremony, or not? And you know what? This is an existential question for us, and especially for Ukraine, that in fact you have to adapt. And this is also the question about today's liberalism and the meaning of freedom. In fact, you have to find a kind of middle way when you have a populist in the White House, when you think of preserving sovereignty, because there's one thing that we know very well in small and medium-sized countries that are neighboring neo-imperial countries, is that sovereignty precedes democracy. First of all, you have to be on the map, and then you could fight for the political regime. Thank you.
There's so much to pick up on these remarks, but let me ask Christina and Constanze, first of all, if we take Constanze's interpretation in terms of this discussion of freedom as the liberal order, just a really simple question. If you think of what were previously regarded as the biggest Western states, the United States, Germany, France, UK, different electoral systems, different heritages, different cultures, but what seems to be uniting them in the last 10 or 15 years is their thorough, almost complete uselessness of the political class in elucidating what freedom means and what liberal democracy means, and how extraordinarily easily they have been played by the far right in all the various examples. We can blame social media as much as we like, and of course that has a major influence on it, but there's something more fundamental going on. What is it, why is it, if you agree with my interpretation, has the notion of freedom become so weak in a liberal interpretation, not in the neoliberal interpretation, in the liberal democratic interpretation of it?
Oh. Well, I think we journalists in particular, we have the easy part. We criticize everything, and particularly the political class. And I think we're wrong to do so. We need politicians. We need good politicians. We need better politicians. And it's not by whipping them, you know, from morning to night that we will encourage the young generation to go into politics. And indeed, you mentioned the last 10, 15 years. Just look at the past 5 years. COVID, did our governments, it's not quite the same, did our governments really misbehave? I don't think so. I think that, and again, in the EU in particular, the fact that we shared vaccines distribution was a very key democratic decision. Common funding, key democratic decision. I just hope that here in Germany, the next German chancellor will engage into a next generation EU package with sort of mutualized financing, especially facing, again, Trumpian America. So I think that COVID, the Ukraine war, have our governments misbehaved when it comes to Ukraine? Of course, we can always say, and I personally believe, that we should have done more earlier when it comes to providing weapons. And I think that all that hesitation about, you know, the red lines and so on and so forth. But did they really misbehave? No. And again, our European governments have remained united in supporting Ukraine, short, of course, of Orbán and Hungary. He's a very skilled politician, a very skilled populist, but it's a small country, and if he loses the 19 billion euros that are needed for his economy that come from Brussels, he'll be in trouble for next year presidential legislative election in his country. So on the whole, I think the picture isn't that bad. Now, of course, people are extremely anxious. Social media, the individualization, the fact that people, everybody and his cousin or her cousin have, you know, the same right to express themselves on social media. And so there's really so much crap that it's almost, how could I put it, vomiting. But it's also freedom. And that gets me to what Constanze was saying, because it's very interesting when you want to talk about disinformation, which is, of course, the plague here in Europe. And when you talk now to the sort of new crowd in DC, they say, oh, you can't use the word disinformation. That's politically incorrect. You have to talk about balanced information or mutual respect information. In other words, there is a politicization of the word information that we have to fight against, because that's obviously, again, what these billionaire tech guys are going to try and impose upon us here in Europe.
I think the expression that Kellyanne Conway, who was the Speaker of the White House in the first Trump administration, used was, he was offering an alternative truth.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, yes, that's a lovely expression.
Yeah, and I think, honestly, if you give up the notion that there is such a thing as truth, and that, in fact, there are, you know, many different versions of truth, and that they're equally legitimate, you've already lost the fight, right? But, John, I'm sorry, what exactly is your question to me?
It was the same question to Christina. Why is it that there has been such, in my view, I throw this out as a contention, a failure of leadership in the major Western countries? We look at the Baltic. Of course, we start with Ukraine. We look at Poland. We look at the Baltics, and we look at some of the Nordics, and as the contradistinction to that. Mm-hmm. But in the heart of Europe, there has been, in Germany, France, UK, and in the United States, in terms of the Democratic Party, such a failure of leadership in making freedom sound compelling, particularly to younger audiences. Why?
All right, and I sort of want to apologize, because some of you may have been seeing me swallowing yawns, and the reason for that is that I'm just arrived from Washington last night, and I'm still very, very jet-lagged. So if any of my answers are disjointed, please blame that. You know, I'm struggling with your question, and I was struggling with it while listening to Christine respond. Because it seems to it seems to, as it were, single out for blame politicians and leaders, right? Whereas I think that the work of preserving democracy is for all of us, right? And because I also have, over the course of my time as a journalist and then as a think tanker, met a lot of what struck me as incredibly hard-working politicians who were decent, principled, and who were really trying very hard to work for change. And when I hear today how people are being threatened, right? And not just with the loss of their livelihoods, but threatened with physical harm, right? Because they are politicians, it strikes me that something has gone very badly wrong, and that possibly starts with expectations, as it were, consumerist expectations in the electorate of what politicians ought to be able to do with them, and at what speed and in what completeness, that are wildly exaggerated and frankly dangerous, right? So I sort of want to, as it were, put in a word for politicians. I will also say, though, that perhaps there is a generational difference at play here. I'm the child of war children, German war children. My father was drafted as a 17-year-old into the Wehrmacht, right, and then became very quickly a very grateful American POW, right? My mother survived the bombing of Berlin as an 11-year-old. My parents were, in other words, old enough to have very vivid and specific memories that they passed on to their children, but too young to have themselves committed war crimes. And that, I think, is true even for my father as a young soldier. I believe it to be true. Let me put it this way. I can't guarantee it to you. I also, in terms of my personal experience, because my father joined the Foreign Service, I finished high school in Madrid right after Franco's death, and I witnessed the transformation, two things, the self-transformation of what Western Europeans so far had thought to be a completely untransformable, backwards, sort of deeply Catholic and sort of reactionary society into a very vibrant democracy that immediately made a hard run for NATO and the EU. But I also witnessed countries, including my own, including Germany, very actively engage in very muscular democracy promotion, something against which we later on developed an allergy, right? So, whereas I feel that, so I have a very specific, as it were, generational attitude to this, which is that I know from my parents just how precious this is, right? They were the generation that stood in the ruins of Europe and said this must never happen again, and we must never let our country be able to do it to anybody again. But I also saw, a country choosing democracy, right? In the same way that Ukraine is now choosing democracy in Europe, right? Despite the fact that it is living in what you could call a permanent state of emergency right now, right? But I think we also perhaps fail to understand two things that are very different about the young generations that are now choosing or flirting with authoritarianism. And that is that whereas we grew up in the permanent promise of the world after the fall of the wall and the enlargement of Europe and NATO, and the sense of linear progress towards prosperity and freedom and if you will, liberal entropy across the world, this generation grew up in the ruins of the international financial order of the global financial crisis, grew up with a sense that the West was getting involved in permanent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that had no obvious ending and were not leading to success. And I think one thing that's really notable about this new American administration that will be inaugurated next Monday is that so many of them are not just veterans of these wars, but angry and disillusioned veterans of wars. And I think we cannot overestimate the importance of this aspect, right? There is a sense that the liberal order that we, growing up, believed in so firmly, right, has betrayed itself, betrayed its voters, and betrayed the rest of the world. And that's on us.
Thank you for that. Volodymyr, I just, with Ukrainians fighting for their very existence, with the last 3 years having been what they are, and in the east of the country much longer than that, how do you see the embrace, old and increasingly the young, of authoritarianism, far-right or ultra-right or alt-right, in Western Europe, the reinterpretation of freedom by others to mean things that do not correspond to the old liberal order or to liberal values? Given that you are getting your hands very dirty all the time and fighting for your existence, how do you see it being discarded or devalued in other countries with both anger and alacrity?
Right, so I will probably follow up on what Constanze was saying, because, yeah, this is very interesting how you depicted the differences of generations. But we also, I think, and I agree with you that there is can be this perception of betrayal, that there is a perception of hypocrisy of liberalism, you know. And I think this is kind of this elephant in the room about which we need to talk, because people who are challenging liberalism, what we call populism, are probably challenging it also in the values of the way how they understand freedom. So it's a very paradoxical freedom from freedom, right? And because they consider that this liberal order is actually not about freedom, but about privileges, about hidden hierarchies, about inequalities, and so on and so forth. So indeed, therefore, I'm saying that populism is really a wrong word, because it doesn't help us to really diagnose it, what is happening. Because populism is from populus, right? It's a synonym of democracy. In the 19th century, it was a synonym of democracy, basically. And we need to understand whether the people want more freedom, more liberty, or they want less freedom. And this is a very important thing. But I do think that despite this disappointment, which I observe here all the time when I'm come here, and which is strikingly different from what we are experiencing I do think that there is a very important for Europe, for America, to regain the faith in itself. What I really, this is what my friend, French philosopher Pascal Bruckner calls la tyrannie de la pénitence, the tyranny of self-guilt, of self-flagellation. Of course, there are problems of European colonialism and imperialism. Of course, there are problems of the war in Afghanistan, in Iraq, etc., etc. But are other societies better? Was slavery invented by the West? No. The slavery existed long before the West, and we Ukrainians know it very, very well. So instead, all this tradition, all this liberal tradition which was developed, I think it's a big treasure for at least a big part of humanity. And I do think that Ukrainian example, Georgian example, Moldovan example, Belarusian example in 2020, maybe examples of many, many other states around the world show that these values matter. But they matter when you fight for them. Again, I'm coming back to my previous idea. They don't matter that when you take them for granted. And I do think that Europe is increasingly well. This is now a very, very challenging thing. What is really striking for me is why far right in Europe and America perceives Russia as the allies, because Russia is not about conservatism. Putinism is not about conservatism. It's all fake. It's all disinformation. It's all, take family values. It's not about family values. Russia is really struggling with huge level of domestic violence, which is projecting in this war, and you can see it. So when we look at this, I think that what we really afraid of is the West losing faith in itself, and losing faith in those values that can never be ideal. I mean, there is always this level of utopianism in liberalism, of course. But at the same time, the alternative is, okay, you promote certain values and you say, well, others say you are hypocritical because you don't follow them enough. But what is the alternative? I always say to the people from the let's say non-Western countries, or what is called probably misleadingly global South countries, what is your idea of the world? If you don't want this international order based upon, unviolability of borders and international law and international humanitarian law, what is your idea of the world? And they don't have an answer, because their idea of the world is to challenge the West, and that's it. And this reminds me of old Russian anarchism, which brought then Russian Bolshevism, which was the idea, okay, we have a bad Tsar, we need to replace it with a good Tsar. And of course, if you replace it with a so-called good Tsar, but keep the system bad, it still be bad. So I do think that if Ukraine loses the war, this will be the end of Europe, because everything that we think about this ideal European space will be completely destroyed. The idea that you cannot cross the borders, the idea that you cannot solve problems peacefully will be destroyed. And it's also a very important thing. I also want to challenge Alan in this. I don't think that ideal of liberalism is having a society without fear. I think it's absolutely unrealistic. We are human beings. We have fear. It's normal that we have fear. Of course, tyrannies, as we know from Montesquieu and etc., they produce fear. That's the thing. But fear is natural. The question is whether you produce it or not artificially. But the task is not to have fear, but we be fearless in a situation that is fearsome. Fearlessness in a situation when there is fear is very important. I think that Europe so far doesn't have fear enough, that it might not have a future in a few decades. And I think fear, existential fear, is something that is also need to be produced in Europe, because the values that Europe is based upon are in crisis, and we need to have fear that we will lose them. And probably this fear will probably mobilize Europe much more.
Just on this final point about we need to have more fear and the question of loss and not feeling that loss, is it therefore to extrapolate from what you've said that for people really to value something, they need to lose it or be close to losing it? Ukraine is absolutely in that position. If you look at comfortable Germany, France, UK, US, they're a long way from that. Do things have to get a lot worse?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not stressing on fear. I'm stressing on faith and believe in yourself. But I do think that, well, I'm a philosopher, so it brings me to a very, fundamental philosophical things. We are mortal. We are facing death, all of us. But at the same time, as Blaise Pascal was saying, there is immortality and infinity which is reflected in us. That's about human nature. We're both mortal and immortal, if you want. We have this mortal immortality in ourselves. And of course, we value things when we understand that they are mortal too. We value home when we understand that we can lose it, or when we lose it. I mean, in the first weeks of this big-scale invasion, I was evacuating my family to kind of a more safer regions in Ukraine. I've never felt so bad losing home. This is a very existential thing, and I have my friends who lost their homes. Really, this is very, very existential thing. Of course, you value life when you understand that it is fragile. And I do think that when we understand that freedom is fragile, and as I started already, it's not guaranteed, it's not a warm bath, it's an exception. Freedom is an exception because most creatures want to be or tend to be unfree. But when we understand that this is fragile, it probably leads us more to mobilize forces and to defend it.
Jarosław, final observations from you, picking up from any of the points discussed.
Well, to follow up this Western self-doubt, problem, I believe that it's one of the crucial political issues of our time. Because for me, it's painful to see that I was in Kiev after Maidan, and later, after February 2022, also it was possible, when we are talking about mortality and freedom, it was possible to see growing cemeteries, growing and growing. And for a Poles, it's moving because, for instance, in Lvov, you have this old Czechov cemetery, the old Polish bourgeoisie cemetery, and just next to it, you have this huge new cemetery of those who were killed at war. And you know what? These are two different styles, but it tells us so much about the world we're living, because, in fact, already during Euromaidan, people were killed for the European Union. That's unbelievable, but you know, when we are hearing about all those complaining about Brussels, that it's boring, and administration that is uninspiring, perhaps. But you know, in Georgia, people are beaten for being members of this European Union. And this is one of the most important political issues. Where is this solidarity among Democrats? Because we see this pervert solidarity among populists that is thriving. And what is lacking us is really the solidarity between Democrats, liberal Democrats. It's really insufficient for the level of challenges. And you've mentioned that we are threatened, politicians are threatened. Yes, but where they are threatened? In the cybersphere. Our public sphere was hijacked, if not stolen, by
they are physically threatened all the time on the streets.
Physically threatened. Yes, but it starts, you know, on a huge scale in the cybersphere. So we see that certainly the problem is digital sovereignty. But you know, that's perhaps for another panel, for another discussion. The main point is that really there is too much self-doubt in the West, and there are people dying in many countries for European values, for liberal democracy, and it should be really taken into consideration. Thank you.
Well, let's hope the conversations this afternoon can address these questions of self-doubt with a positive outlook in helping to remove some of the self-doubt as we're only just starting in the new Trump Mark II era. I feel we've only just started this conversation, but our hour is up. And I'm sorry I can't be with you this afternoon. I'm told that lunch is ready and you can all continue the conversations on these vitally important topics. Please thank our panelists.